Most people know Jimmy Carter, the peanut farmer, the peacemaker, the president with the cardigan. But there was someone else in that story who nobody planned for. His name was Billy, and by the time it was over, he had registered as a foreign agent of one of the most hostile governments on the planet, triggered a Senate investigation that consumed the final stretch of his brother's presidency, and become the punchline to a decade of jokes he had largely written himself. This is one of those stories that starts as a comedy and ends as something much harder to laugh at. Segment 9. Plains, Georgia, and the shadow of a famous name. Billy Carter was born on March 29, 1937, in Plains, Georgia. The same small town, the same family, the same peanut farm that would eventually produce a president of the United States. He was the fourth and youngest child of James Earl Carter Sr. and Lillian Gordy Carter. Jimmy was 13 years older than Billy, a gap wide enough that the two brothers grew up in almost different generations under the same roof. Their father, James Earl Carter Sr., was the center of the family's business world. He ran a general store, invested in farmland, and built the family's peanut operation into something real. When he died in 1953, Jimmy, who had been away at the Naval Academy and then serving in the Navy, came home to take over. Billy was 16 years old. By most accounts, that decision stung. Billy had grown up expecting to inherit a role in the family business on his own terms, in his own time. Instead, the older brother, who had been largely absent, came back and stepped right into the center of things. Billy joined the Marines instead. He attended Emory University in Atlanta without completing a degree, married his wife, Sybil Spires, in 1955 at the age of 18, and eventually came back to Plains to work in the peanut warehouse alongside Jimmy. He was good at it. By 1970, Billy was the managing partner and held a 15% ownership stake in the Carter peanut operation. By 1976, he had built revenues to $5 million a year. He boasted openly that he made more money running the warehouse than Jimmy ever had. He also owned and operated a gas and service station in Plains that he had purchased in 1972, a place that, at its peak, moved 2,000 cases of beer a month and more than 40,000 gallons of gas. He sold barbecued ribs and catfish. He kept the beer cold and the conversation going. The station became its own small world, the unofficial gathering place for locals, reporters, and anyone else passing through Plains with a few minutes and a thirst. Billy was smart. He was a voracious reader who, according to people who knew him well, would sometimes wake at 4 a.m. to start a book and finish it before breakfast. He was quick with words, quick with a joke, and deeply comfortable in his own skin in a way that his more polished, more careful older brother was not. He described himself once as a George Wallace Democrat. He wore blue jeans and baseball caps. He drank beer publicly, cheerfully, and in impressive quantities. When Jimmy Carter entered national politics, all of that became a story. And Billy, whether he fully understood it or not in the beginning, became a character. The two brothers had lived largely parallel lives by the time Jimmy ran for president. Jimmy had gone to the Naval Academy, served on submarines, come home to run the peanut business, entered Georgia politics, and climbed steadily upward through the state senate, the governorship, and eventually the White House. Billy had stayed in Plains, kept the warehouse running, raised 6 children with Sybil, and built a life that was entirely his own. They were not estranged. They were brothers who genuinely cared about each other, but they were shaped by the same town and the same family in ways that had pulled them in almost opposite directions. Segment 8. The Rise of the Good Old Boy. When Jimmy Carter launched his campaign for the presidency in the mid-1970s, the national press descended on Plains, Georgia, looking for color. They found it. The tiny town of fewer than 700 people suddenly had television cameras on every corner, reporters camped outside the gas station, and a cast of local characters who had never asked to be famous. Billy was the most interesting of all of them. He held court at the gas station like a man born to it. He talked to reporters freely, without a handler or a filter, which was practically unheard of in a presidential campaign. He said whatever was on his mind. He cracked jokes at his own family's expense. One of his most quoted lines was delivered with total ease. He pointed out that his mother had joined the Peace Corps at 68. One sister was an evangelical faith healer. Another rode motorcycles. His brother thought he was going to be president, and then he said that as far as he could tell, he was the only sane one in the family. The press ate it up. After years of Watergate and the carefully managed stagecraft of Washington politics, here was a man who seemed genuinely incapable of pretension. He was the anti-politician in a moment when the country was hungry for something real. When Billy ran for mayor of Plains in 1976, the same year Jimmy won the presidency, his loss made national news. He got 71 votes. His opponent, A.L. Blanton, an air traffic controller from Albany, got 97. The defeat was covered by the Atlanta Journal, the Atlanta Constitution, the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC, CBS, NBC, Reuters, and Agence France Presse. No one covering that race was there because of the race. They were there because of Billy. By the time Jimmy Carter took office in January 1977, Billy had become a kind of accidental celebrity. He hired an agent. He started making public appearances for $5,000 each. He endorsed a beer, Billy Beer, introduced by the Falls City Brewing Company in September 1977, that put his name on a can and his face in stores across the country. His endorsement described him as one of America's all-time great beer drinkers. He said he'd had it brewed just for himself, and that he thought it was the best he'd ever tasted, adding that he'd tasted a lot. He once joked that he might become the Colonel Sanders of beer. He also served as the official spokesperson for Peanut Lolita, a peanut-flavored liqueur, and had his name lent to a toy pickup truck model kit. He judged a belly flop championship. He took a small acting part in a television movie about women truck drivers. He published a book called Redneck Power: The Wit and Wisdom of Billy Carter. His name appeared as a gag answer on Match Game, the television game show, whenever contestants were asked to name a Washington troublemaker. The press had found their character. They wrote about him endlessly, part cracker barrel philosopher, part redneck caricature, part jester in the royal court of the Carter White House. Jimmy Carter, asked by journalists about his ability to manage his younger brother, reportedly said that he had more influence over members of the United States Senate than he did over Billy. It was a funny line. For a while, it was all funny. But the drinking was getting worse, and the Libyans had just noticed Billy Carter existed. Segment 7. The Libyan Connection begins. The chain of events that would eventually become one of the most embarrassing political scandals of the Carter presidency began, improbably, at a vacation rental in Sicily. In the early summer of 1978, an Atlanta lawyer named Mario Lianza was on holiday when he met a Sicilian man with connections to Libyan diplomats. The Libyans, he was told, were looking for American business contacts. Specifically, they were interested in establishing ties with influential Americans who might help soften Libya's image in the United States. Libya, under Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, had seized power in a military coup in 1969 and had since built a reputation as a bankroller of international terrorism and a fierce opponent of Israel. Relations with the United States were deeply strained. American arms sales to Libya had been curtailed. Diplomatic contact was minimal. What Gaddafi's government wanted was a back channel, ideally one connected, however loosely, to the American president. What Lianza was not told directly, but what was clearly understood, was that the ideal contact would be someone close to the White House. Lianza came home and mentioned the encounter to a real estate developer in Atlanta named Thomas Jordan. Jordan knew someone who knew someone in the Georgia State Senate, and eventually a chain of introductions led, on July 4th, 1978, to a meeting in Billy Carter's gas station in Plains. A former Libyan diplomat named Jibril Shalouf rode down to Plains with Jordan and a Georgia state senator to meet Billy in person. Billy was invited to visit Tripoli as a guest of the Libyan government. He was interested. He was also drinking heavily by this point. By 1979, he was consuming roughly half a gallon of vodka and whiskey a day. His judgment was impaired in ways that were visible to people around him, though not, apparently, to Billy himself. In August 1978, Billy and a business associate named Randy Coleman called the National Security Council to request a briefing on Libya before making the trip. A foreign policy analyst named William Quandt took the call and warned them that the visit could complicate the Camp David negotiations, which were ongoing and extremely sensitive. The Israeli-Egyptian peace process was the centerpiece of Jimmy Carter's foreign policy, and Libya under Colonel Muammar Gaddafi was fiercely and publicly opposed to anything that looked like Arab accommodation with Israel. Billy was not interested in being warned. He told the National Security Council staff, in so many words, that he did not need Washington telling him how to handle Libyans. In September 1978, 1 week after the Camp David Accords were announced, Billy flew to Tripoli with a group of Atlanta businessmen, all expenses paid by the Libyan government. They visited farms and schools and housing projects and attended a series of meals and receptions. Business discussions took place. Gifts were exchanged. Billy came home satisfied. The problem was that nobody in the White House had been told he was going until his plane was already in the air. Jimmy Carter learned of his brother's departure to Libya after takeoff. The White House, trying to contain the damage, had the State Department instruct its officials in Tripoli to treat the visit as unofficial and to caution Billy again about the sensitivity of U.S.-Libyan relations when he arrived. By January 1979, Billy was hosting a Libyan trade delegation on a tour of American cities, including Atlanta. The Atlanta mayor at the time, Maynard Jackson, declined to meet with the delegation. Billy was furious. He complained publicly that Jackson was being pressured by the city's Jewish community to snub the Arabs, and then said, in terms that made headlines, that there were far more Arabs in the world than there were Jews. When the remarks drew outrage, he responded with characteristic defiance, saying those who didn't like it could kiss his anatomy. The remarks drew condemnation, not just from Jewish groups, but from members of Congress, and put the White House in the position of having to distance itself from the president's brother without publicly humiliating him. It was during this same Atlanta visit, while waiting outside for the Libyan delegation's plane to land, that Billy urinated against the wall of a building in full view of the assembled press and dignitaries. He later explained that he couldn't find a men's room. It became one of the most widely repeated stories of the entire Carter era, the kind of incident that, had it involved any other person in any other context, would have been forgotten in a week. But because it involved the president's brother and a Libyan diplomatic delegation, became a permanent fixture in the cultural shorthand around the Carter White House. None of this stopped what was coming next. Segment 6: Money, Denial, and the FBI. In January 1979, the United States Department of Justice sent Billy Carter the first of 2 letters, asking him to register as a foreign agent. The Foreign Agents Registration Act required anyone working to advance the interests of a foreign government within the United States to formally declare that relationship to the federal government. Billy ignored the request. By March 1979, the FBI had opened a formal investigation into the legality of his activities. When federal investigators asked whether he had received any compensation from the Libyans, he said no. That answer was already wrong. He had received travel expenses and gifts, and more was coming. In April 1979, Billy began working with a business associate to broker a deal that would channel Libyan crude oil to a Florida company called Charter Oil. He negotiated a fee of 55 cents per barrel on the oil. The arrangement did not go through in full, but the effort made clear that Billy saw the Libyan relationship in financial terms, not just social ones. In August 1979, he flew to Tripoli again, this time for the 10th anniversary celebration of Gaddafi's takeover of the Libyan government in 1969. When he returned to the United States, the Justice Department formally renewed its request that he register as a foreign agent. He still refused. Then the money started arriving. In January 1980, Billy received a check from the Libyan government for $20,000. When FBI investigators asked him again whether he had received any payment from Libya, he said no. According to investigators who later reviewed the evidence, the check had been deposited 2 weeks before he was asked the question. He had told the FBI one thing, while cashing a government check from a foreign power with which the United States had deeply adversarial relations. It was not a minor inconsistency. In April 1980, he received an additional $200,000, bringing his total acknowledged receipts to $220,000. This was described in his eventual registration statement as installments on a $500,000 loan that had been promised by the Libyan government in exchange for his services. The loan had no notes and nothing in writing. There was no clear mechanism by which it would ever need to be repaid. Critics pointed out that a loan without paperwork from a foreign government with no repayment plan was difficult to distinguish from a payment. One former intelligence operative, Edwin P. Wilson, later claimed to have seen a telegram suggesting that the actual amount Libya transferred to Billy Carter was closer to $2 million. That claim was never definitively proven, and Wilson was himself a controversial figure with his own legal problems. But it was out there, circulating in Washington in a way that made every denial harder to sustain. On June 10, 1980, Billy went to the Justice Department to check on the progress of the investigation. During that visit, he finally admitted to receiving the payments. On June 17th, Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti privately told President Carter that his brother should register as a foreign agent. By July 14, 1980, under court order and under protest, and at his brother's request, he said, Billy Carter registered as a foreign agent of the government of Libya. What he had registered for the public record was stark. $220,000 in cash received, nearly $3,000 in personal gifts, including gold bracelets, a saddle, a ceremonial sword, and a suit of clothes, and almost $16,000 in travel expenses across multiple trips to Tripoli. The press had a name for it within days. Billygate. Segment 5. The Senate comes knocking. The Senate voted unanimously to open an investigation 10 days after the Justice Department disclosed that Billy Carter had registered as a foreign agent. A subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee was established specifically to investigate what had happened and whether the White House had played any role in enabling or covering up Billy Carter's activities. The timing was catastrophic for Jimmy Carter. The Iran hostage crisis had been consuming the presidency since November 1979. More than 50 American diplomats and citizens had been held captive in Tehran for months following the seizure of the United States Embassy. Every attempt to resolve the situation, diplomatic, legal, and ultimately a military rescue mission in April 1980 that ended in disaster when helicopters failed in the Iranian desert, had come to nothing. The hostages were still there. The world was watching. And now the president's brother was front-page news for taking money from a government the United States considered a state sponsor of terrorism. Jimmy Carter was running for re-election against Ronald Reagan, and the numbers were not good. The economy was suffering from what economists called stagflation, simultaneous high inflation and high unemployment, and the combined rate of inflation and unemployment, a figure commentators called the misery index, was running well above 20%. Members of his own Democratic Party had questioned whether he should even seek renomination, and he had only narrowly survived a primary challenge from Senator Ted Kennedy. Into all of that came Billygate. The Senate investigation ran through the summer and fall of 1980, with hearings held over multiple days in August, September, and October. Witnesses included senior White House staff, intelligence officials, and members of the Carter administration. Thousands of documents were produced. More than 30 witnesses testified. One particularly damaging disclosure emerged during the investigation. The administration had used Billy as an informal intermediary in November 1979, when National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski met with Billy and a Libyan diplomat in Washington to explore whether Libya might use its influence with Iran to help secure the release of the American hostages. The approach went nowhere, but the fact that the White House had turned to the president's brother, a man who was already under scrutiny for his Libyan connections, as a back channel to a hostile government was deeply embarrassing. A further revelation emerged in July 1980, when it became known that President Carter had shared confidential State Department cables with his brother relating to Billy's first trip to Tripoli in 1978. The White House confirmed this after it was already public. Jimmy Carter had penned a brief handwritten note on a cable and mailed it to Billy. The cables contained sensitive diplomatic reporting from the American embassy in Libya. Sharing them was, at minimum, a serious lapse in judgment. The Senate subcommittee eventually concluded that no criminal wrongdoing had been proven, and that Billy Carter had not influenced American policy toward Libya. But the final report did not clear the administration entirely. It questioned whether the president should have issued a stronger public statement, disassociating himself from his brother when it became clear what was happening. It questioned the use of Billy as a diplomatic back channel, and it criticized the administration for not acting sooner. For Jimmy Carter, the political damage was severe. He later recalled spending large stretches of what should have been a presidential re-election campaign defending his brother to the press instead of making the case for his own record. Meanwhile, there was a layer to the Billygate story that only came to light years later, one that suggested the scandal had not entirely been what it seemed. Segment 4. The Disinformation Question. In 1985, a Wall Street Journal investigation raised something that fundamentally complicated the story of Billygate. A journalist named Jonathan Whitney reported that a series of damaging articles about Billy Carter's Libyan connections, published in the New Republic magazine in October 1980, right before the presidential election, had been part of a disinformation campaign run by Italian military intelligence. According to the reporting, an officer of SISMI, the Italian intelligence service, named Francesco Pazienza, had orchestrated the effort. Pazienza claimed that a well-known American political writer named Michael Ledeen had been paid at least $120,000 for his work on the Billygate articles and other related projects. The payments were allegedly sent to a Bermuda bank account. Ledeen reportedly had a coded identity, Z3, within the operation. The articles, timed to run weeks before the November 1980 election, were designed to amplify and intensify the damage of Billygate at precisely the moment it could do the most harm to Jimmy Carter's re-election campaign. Pazienza was later tried and convicted in absentia in Italy on multiple charges, including using extortion and fraud to obtain embarrassing information about Billy Carter. His indictment specifically cited the collaboration with Ledeen and SISMI. Ledeen was never charged with any crime in the United States, though he was named in Pazienza's indictment. He acknowledged that his consulting firm had worked for SISMI, but said he did not recall certain specifics. Joseph Trento, a journalist and intelligence historian, went further in subsequent reporting, asserting that the entire Libyan cultivation of Billy Carter had itself been instigated by Israeli intelligence as a covert operation, aimed at undermining Jimmy Carter, who had reportedly ended what Trento described as Israel's special status within the CIA. That claim remains contested and difficult to verify. What is harder to contest is the timing. Billygate erupted in full public view during one of the most vulnerable moments of the Carter presidency, was amplified by articles that may have been planted by a foreign intelligence service and contributed to the perception of a White House in chaos, at a moment when Jimmy Carter could least afford that perception. Billy Carter himself had done everything he was accused of. That was never in question. He had taken the money, made the trips, ignored the warnings, defied the Justice Department, and registered as a foreign agent under protest. None of that was fabricated. But the degree to which the scandal was allowed to dominate the final months of the 1980 campaign, and who was helping it dominate, was a more complicated question than the headlines suggested at the time. Segment 3. The weight of it all. While Washington argued over the implications of Billygate, Billy Carter was in trouble that went well beyond politics. By 1979, the drinking had become critical. He was consuming half a gallon of spirits a day. In February of that year, he checked himself into a 7-week rehabilitation program at the Long Beach Naval Hospital in California. He came out publicly declaring himself a reformed alcoholic and was, for a period, open about the experience in a way that people who knew him found genuinely courageous. He stayed sober. He worked at it. People around him, including his own children, later said that his recovery was the thing he was most proud of, more than anything else that had happened to him in the public spotlight, more than the beer and the appearances and the scandal. His son, Buddy, speaking years after Billy's death, said that if his father had been alive, he would have put his sobriety first in any account of his life. But even as he got clean, the practical consequences of everything that had come before were landing hard. In 1981, the Internal Revenue Service pressed him for $105,000 in back taxes. He was forced to sell his gas station, his home in Plains, and other properties to satisfy the IRS and local creditors. The gas station, the place where he had held court for a decade, where reporters and tourists and neighbors had gathered around his stories, went at auction. He moved his family to Haleyville, Alabama, where he went to work in sales for Tidwell Industries, a company that made mobile homes. The man who had been the most talked-about face in American tabloids 3 years earlier was now selling prefabricated houses door to door in a mid-sized Alabama town. A few years later, he became vice president of marketing at Scott Housing Systems. In 1985, he entered a guilty plea on behalf of that company on charges related to padding the costs of federally funded housing, a relatively minor legal matter compared to everything that had come before, but another entry in a long list of things that had gone wrong. He moved back to Plains eventually. He was quiet. He gave occasional interviews. He stayed sober. Friends and family who saw him during this period described a man who was genuinely different from the one the press had known. Calmer, more reflective, more interested in the people around him than in performing for an audience that had mostly moved on. In the fall of 1987, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The disease had already taken his sister Ruth Carter Stapleton, who died of it in 1983 at 54. Their father had died of the same disease in his 50s. The Carter family carried it like a shadow. Billy received treatment at the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, Maryland, including an experimental drug called interleukin-2, which carried severe side effects. The treatment did not work. Segment 2, September 25, 1988. Billy Carter died at his home in Plains on September 25, 1988. He was 51 years old. At his bedside when he died were his wife Sybil and their 6 children, Kim, Jana, Buddy, Marl, Mandy, and Earl, who was 12 years old when his father died. His sister Gloria was there. Jimmy Carter, who lived next door, had visited multiple times the day before and had been in again early that morning. The family statement said he had gone quietly and peacefully in his sleep. It said he had struggled courageously with his illness, never losing his sense of humor, and had been more concerned about the people who loved him than about himself. He was buried in Plains. Jimmy Carter, speaking about his brother years later for a podcast called Mobituaries, said that Billy had become the most famous person in the entire Carter family. He spoke warmly about Billy's good humor and hard work, and acknowledged how much the press had shaped and eventually turned on his brother's image. He said that Billy had been the media's darling for years, that reporters had loved his stories and his irreverence, and that when the Libyan story became the dominant narrative, the same press that had celebrated him turned on him with the same energy. He said he had spent too much of his time during the presidency defending Billy instead of explaining what his administration was actually doing. What he did not say publicly, but what the record suggests, is that he never really tried to stop Billy. He placed his own assets in a blind trust when he entered the White House, and a presidential aide named Charles Kerbo was assigned to oversee the day-to-day operations of the Carter Peanut Warehouse. But Billy was not Jimmy. Billy could not be managed by a presidential aide. He was outside the structure, and Jimmy Carter seems to have understood and accepted that his brother was going to live his life on his own terms, regardless of the address across the street. There is something in that admission that captures the central tension of the whole story. Jimmy Carter never cut Billy off, never publicly disowned him in the way a political strategist might have advised. When the Senate investigation was pressing hardest, when the White House was being asked every day whether the president could control his own brother, Jimmy Carter held the line. His public statement on Billy's Libyan dealings was measured and careful. He expressed deep concern, said it would affect their relationship, and stated clearly that Billy had no influence over U.S. policy. But he did not abandon Billy. He asked him, privately, to register as a foreign agent, and Billy did it. The relationship between them had always been complicated. There was the 13-year gap. There was the question of who got to run the family business. There was the fundamental difference in temperament between a man who became president by discipline and calculation and a younger brother who moved through the world on instinct and humor and, for a long stretch of years, alcohol. Billy's daughter Jana, speaking publicly after her father's death, pushed back on how he had been portrayed. She said the press had made her father look stupid, and that he was not stupid. His widow Sybil said that Billy had been playing to what the press wanted, performing the redneck character because he understood that was what they had come to see, and testing how far he could push it. That may be true, but it also doesn't account for everything. The Libyan payments were real. The denial to the FBI was real. The foreign agent's registration was real. Whatever the press exaggerated or the intelligence services manipulated, Billy Carter had walked into that situation with his eyes open and his judgment compromised. His sister, Ruth, had called him Brother Billy in a book she wrote in 1978. It was the most precise summary of what he was. Not a politician, not a criminal, not a buffoon, but a brother. A particular kind of American brother, raised in a particular place at a particular time, who loved his family and resented parts of what his family had become, and who couldn't quite find a way to live comfortably inside the story that history had decided to tell about him. Segment 1. What remained? A year and a half after Billy died, his sister Gloria Carter Spann died of pancreatic cancer at 63. The disease had now taken 3 members of the same generation of Carters. Jimmy Carter lived to 100. He died in December 2024, more than 36 years after his younger brother. In the decades between Billy's death and his own, Jimmy Carter rebuilt his post-presidential reputation into something remarkable. The Carter Center, the peace negotiations, the Habitat for Humanity houses, the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. The presidency itself, which had ended in defeat in 1980, was eventually reappraised. The Camp David Accords held. The Panama Canal Treaty held. His human rights framework shaped American foreign policy for decades. The gas station in Plains, where Billy held court for years, became the Billy Carter Service Station Museum in 2009, administered by the University of Georgia. It sits there still, in a town of fewer than 500 people, on the main street of what was briefly the most watched small town in America. Billy Beer, once marketed as a cultural phenomenon, ended production after about a year. The beer can collectors who initially paid top dollar for the cans eventually discovered what the Brewery Collectibles Club of America later described as the product being incredibly abundant and virtually worthless. Billy himself, when told in 1981 that a single can had reportedly sold for $1,000, said he'd like to find the person who paid that, because he thought he still had a couple of six-packs he'd be happy to move. The joke landed the way Billy's jokes always landed: dry, self-aware, and slightly sad if you listened closely enough. He had been the most famous member of the Carter family during the years when fame mattered most. And then he had become the most embarrassing. And then, very quietly, he had become something else. A man who got sober and helped other people do the same. A father of 6 who died in his own bed, in his own town, with his family around him. A brother who was loved by a man who never stopped being his brother, whatever the cost. The Senate subcommittee found no criminal wrongdoing. The scholars who later examined the Carter presidency found that Billygate had no measurable effect on American foreign policy toward Libya. But the time it consumed, the oxygen it took from a White House already struggling for air, the columns and broadcasts and hearings that filled 1980 while the hostage crisis ground on and the election approached. That was real. That cost something. Billy Carter never asked to be a political figure. He asked to run a gas station and drink beer and be left alone to live the life he wanted. History handed him something else entirely, and he handled it the only way he knew how. Loudly, imperfectly, and on his own terms, right up until he couldn't anymore. Billy Carter was born on March 29th, 1937, and died on September 25th, 1988, at 51 years old. The youngest of the Carter siblings to go, in a family that cancer stalked across generations. He was many things at once: a genuinely shrewd businessman, a gifted, natural performer, a man with a serious drinking problem who eventually found his way out of it, a brother who stumbled into the orbit of a hostile foreign government and paid for it in ways he probably never fully calculated, and a person who was understood almost entirely through a caricature that he had helped create, and then couldn't escape. The presidency he haunted ended in defeat. The brother he embarrassed outlived him by nearly 4 decades. The town he made famous still sits in southwest Georgia, population shrinking, the gas station turned into a museum, the old peanut fields still there in the heat. And somewhere in between the Billy beer cans and the Senate transcripts and the airport incident and the Libyan payments and the sobriety chips and the pancreatic ward in Bethesda, there was a real person, one that most of the people who wrote about him at the time didn't quite bother to find. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.